By 1944, the tide of World War II had decisively turned against the Third Reich. The skies over Germany were filled with the constant roar of Allied bomber formations, delivering an unstoppable stream of destruction. German commanders, once confident of their aerial supremacy, desperately searched for a miracle weapon to halt the relentless advance. That salvation, they believed, lay in a revolutionary piece of technology, the jet aircraft. The speed and firepower of the Messerschmitt Me-262 promised to sweep the lumbering Allied formations from the sky with ease. It represented a technological leap that could instantly nullify the enemy's massive numerical advantage. For the Luftwaffe leadership, the jet was not just a new fighter, it was the ultimate, war-winning equalizer, capable of restoring their dominance. The very concept of a jet-powered fighter was an intoxicating dream for men facing an overwhelming reality of defeat. They envisioned squadrons of these sleek, fast machines decimating the American and British bomber fleets before escort fighters could even react. The potential of the Me-262 to instill fear and hesitation in Allied crews was almost as valuable as its raw killing power. This hope became a central, almost religious, focus for an increasingly cornered military command. The strategic plan was simple yet radical: mass-produce the jets and deploy them as interceptors to shatter the Allies' will to continue the strategic bombing campaign. However, the very desperation that drove this belief also blinded many to the monumental logistical obstacles that lay ahead. The dream of the jet-powered savior was born in a moment of existential military crisis. It was a final, brilliant, but ultimately doomed gamble in the twilight of a collapsing regime. The future of air combat had arrived, but the infrastructure of the past was simply incapable of supporting it. The foundation of the German jet dream was the truly groundbreaking engineering marvel of the Messerschmitt Me-262 Schwalbe, or Swallow. Its development dated back to the late 1930s, long before the immediate military necessity became so dire. This machine was the product of brilliant German aeronautical minds working on the very edge of theoretical physics. The twin Junkers Jumo 00 for axial flow turbojet engines represented a phenomenal advance over conventional propeller-driven propulsion. With these engines, the Me-262 could achieve speeds exceeding 540 miles per hour, making it roughly 100 to 150 miles per hour faster than the best Allied piston engine fighters. At that velocity, Allied escort fighters like the P-51 Mustang struggled merely to keep the jet in sight, let alone engage it effectively. The Me-262 was typically armed with four powerful 30 million Malawian Quachas 108 cannon, which could destroy a heavy bomber with just a few well-placed hits. Its revolutionary swept-wing design, an unintentional benefit from a weight shift, also contributed to its high-speed performance and stability. For pilots, flying the jet was an experience fundamentally different from any previous aircraft, offering a smooth, vibration-free ride at incredible velocity. The jet era had essentially begun in secret German workshops, fundamentally changing the definition of aerial warfare. Yet, this technology was temperamental and fraught with developmental issues that never fully disappeared. The service life of the early Jumo 00 for engines was notoriously short, sometimes failing after as little as 10 hours of operation. Manufacturing the precision components for the engines was a colossal challenge for an economy already strained by total war and material shortages. Despite its technical brilliance, the Me-262 was a complex machine that required enormous resources and highly skilled personnel to maintain. It was a truly revolutionary weapon, but it arrived far too late and in an operational environment that could not sustain its high demands. The Me-262's intended role as a high-speed interceptor, its only role that offered a chance of strategic impact, was tragically delayed by political interference. Adolf Hitler, clinging to the doctrine of offensive warfare and driven by a need for propaganda victories, insisted on a disastrous conversion. He demanded that the Me-262 be developed primarily as a high-speed ground attack bomber, or the Blitz bomber, a role for which it was ill-suited. This decision was rooted in a fundamental misunderstanding of air power and the desperate need for air defense over the Reich. Hitler saw the jet as a perfect tool for swift reprisal attacks, a way to deliver a psychological blow rather than a strategic counter to the bomber threat. This directive caused months of precious delay in the jet's entry into service as a dedicated fighter, which was the purpose for which it was actually designed. The Me-262's landing gear was modified, and bomb racks were installed, severely compromising its performance and maneuverability. It was an engineering compromise that wasted the jet's greatest asset, its unmatched speed and altitude performance as an interceptor. Commanders like General Adolf Gauland repeatedly argued to Hitler and Göring that the jet's destiny was purely defensive, to save the Reich's skies. Gauland famously pleaded to create a jet fighter command to deploy the Me-262 in the role for which it was desperately needed. These logical and necessary appeals were largely ignored, sidelined by the political will of a dictator obsessed with offense and revenge weapons. The diversion of the limited production jets to the bomber role meant that too few were available to make a difference against the Allied bomber streams. This internal conflict between technical necessity and political whim was a self-inflicted wound that crippled the jet program from the start. By the time Hitler reluctantly allowed the jet to be used in its proper fighter role, the strategic clock had run down to mere minutes. The Blitz bomber concept ensured that the technological advantage of the Me-262 was never fully realized in the critical air defense battle. The crucial time lost to this folly directly contributed to the inability of the Luftwaffe to ever achieve meaningful resistance. By 1944, the Allied air forces had achieved a state of near-total air supremacy over German territory, a decisive factor in the war. The mighty 8th U.S. Air Force and the RAF's Bomber Command operated with increasing impunity, destroying industrial targets at will. Massive formations of four-engine heavy bombers, like the B-17 Flying Fortress and the Lancaster, flew in wave after wave. Crucially, these bomber streams were now heavily protected by long-range escort fighters, most notably the North American P-51 Mustang. The introduction of drop tanks allowed the P-51s to accompany the bombers all the way to their targets deep inside Germany and back again. This combination of overwhelming numbers and full-time escort protection devastated the remaining, conventional German fighter force. The German piston-engine fighters, such as the Me-109 and Fw-190, were often shot down before they could even reach the bomber formations. The sheer attrition rate of experienced German pilots and irreplaceable aircraft was crippling the Luftwaffe's ability to defend its homeland. It was into this scenario of overwhelming numerical and logistical disadvantage that the Me-262 was supposed to enter as a game-changer. Its speed was the one characteristic that could allow it to bypass the formidable fighter screen and quickly engage the vulnerable bombers. The jet could essentially pick its battles, making lightning-fast passes and utilizing its heavy cannon armament to devastating effect. The theoretical purpose of the Me-262 was to break the back of the Allied strategic bombing campaign, which was throttling the German war economy. The jet was the only weapon that offered a plausible, if desperate, counter to the seemingly endless stream of Allied air power. However, the scale of the Allied commitment was so vast that even a technological marvel would need to be deployed in massive numbers to succeed. The air war had become a battle of industrial capacity, and Germany was already hopelessly behind in producing both pilots and planes. The Me-262 offered a flicker of hope, but the darkness of Allied air dominance was already too profound to fully overcome. For the select few German pilots who first flew the Messerschmitt Me-262 in combat, it must have felt like commanding a ghost. The phenomenal speed of the jet gave them an operational advantage that was unprecedented in the history of aerial warfare up to that time. They could approach the massive Allied bomber formations at such velocity that they became almost invisible to the escort fighters. A pilot could make a devastating, high-speed pass, fire a few bursts, and then zoom out of range before the slower P-51s could even turn to engage. This experience of power and invulnerability must have been exhilarating for pilots accustomed to being outnumbered and outmatched. The jet's acceleration was a revelation, making older propeller planes feel cumbersome and slow by comparison. However, the Me-262 was still an early-generation jet, and it presented its own unique set of dangers and operational limitations. The engines required extremely careful throttle control. Rapid movement could cause a dangerous compressor stall or even an engine flameout. The jet was vulnerable during the critical phases of takeoff and landing, when its speed was lowest and its maneuverability was limited. Allied pilots quickly learned to patrol the airfields, waiting for the jets to be at their most helpless during their slow approaches. Despite the inherent risks, the potential for high-scoring missions against the bomber streams was a powerful motivator for the remaining experienced Luftwaffe aces. The Me-262 became a symbol of German ingenuity, a source of professional pride amidst the ruins of the failing air arm. Yet, this small cadre of elite pilots could only manage a sporadic defense due to the scarcity of the aircraft itself. Each mission was a delicate dance between exploiting the jet's speed and managing its mechanical fragility. The pure technological experience of flying the Me-262 stood in stark contrast to the rapidly deteriorating conditions on the ground. These swallows were true ghosts in the sky, appearing briefly to terrorize the enemy before vanishing on a plume of precious fuel. When the Me-262 finally entered service in late 1944, its impact on the Allied airmen was immediate and profoundly psychological. The first encounters were often a terrifying blur, a momentary flash of movement too fast for the eye to track effectively. American and British fighter pilots reported seeing objects that simply defied the known limits of flight, seemingly appearing and disappearing at will. The speed advantage of the jet made traditional fighter tactics, like pursuit and turning dogfights, entirely obsolete when engaging the Me-262. Bomber gunners had only a fraction of a second to react to the incoming aircraft, often resulting in shots that were wildly inaccurate. The powerful 30mm cannon shells were devastating, capable of tearing a wing or fuselage section from a heavy bomber with a single short burst. Initial Allied intelligence struggled to comprehend the full implications of the new weapon, often underestimating its potential. The presence of the jet alone forced Allied formations to change their flight patterns and increase their vigilance, burning more fuel and stressing their crews. The jet did achieve significant, though localized, success in downing numerous Allied planes in its early operational life. Its debut created a genuine sense of panic within some quarters of the Allied command, which feared the weapon could still turn the tide. The Allies were forced to quickly develop new counter-tactics, primarily focusing on ambushing the jets at their most vulnerable moments. The sheer shock of the Me-262's arrival confirmed the advanced state of German aeronautical engineering. The initial impact of the jet was a clear demonstration of what could have been achieved if the program had been prioritized correctly and deployed sooner. However, the small numbers in which the jets appeared meant that the terror was never sustained long enough to break the Allied campaign. The psychological warfare was effective, but the material damage inflicted was never enough to match the scale of the Allied bomber offensive. The German commanders saw this initial shock as proof of their last great hope, but the underlying issues were already beginning to throttle the momentum. The lifeblood of the German war machine, and especially its ambitious jet program, was a complex, highly vulnerable industrial network. Germany possessed almost no natural oil reserves, making the country utterly dependent on synthetic fuel production. This fuel was created through the painstaking and energy-intensive process of coal liquefaction, a technological solution born out of necessity. Massive plants like Lüneburg and Politz were the industrial cathedrals of this effort, providing the high-octane gasoline and, crucially, the jet fuel. The Me-262's advanced Jumo 00 for engines required a specific, high-quality, and energy-dense fuel, consuming it at an alarming rate. The jet's operational efficiency was directly tied to the unceasing production of this highly specialized synthetic petroleum. Without the complex chemical processes of the synthetic fuel plants, the most advanced aircraft in the world were little more than impressive metal sculptures. The entire Luftwaffe, from its frontline fighters to its training schools, relied on this incredibly fragile industrial supply chain. The location and size of these plants made them impossible to hide, presenting enormous, tempting targets for Allied reconnaissance and bombers. German efforts to disperse production and move operations underground were frantic, but they were consistently overwhelmed by the sheer scale of the Allied attacks. The dependence on this single, artificial source of fuel meant the German war economy had a critical choke point that the Allies could exploit. The strategic thinkers in the Allied forces eventually identified this vulnerability as the most efficient way to cripple the entire German military effort. The entire concept of the jet savior rested precariously upon this fragile foundation of coal-to-oil alchemy. Every flight hour of an Me-262 represented hundreds of gallons of fuel painstakingly extracted from coal under intense wartime pressure. This industrial dependency was the fundamental weakness that Allied strategy would eventually, and decisively, exploit to kill the jet dream. The Allied strategic shift to systematically target German fuel production proved to be one of the most decisive campaigns of the war. Initially, Allied bombing had focused on broad industrial and urban targets, but the oil campaign introduced a precise, suffocating strategy. In May 1944, a series of focused, coordinated attacks were launched against the primary synthetic fuel plants across Germany and occupied territories. The reasoning was simple: grounding the Luftwaffe was more effective than shooting down individual planes in the air. These concentrated raids inflicted catastrophic damage on the chemical and industrial complexes responsible for the coal liquefaction process. Plants that had taken years to build and perfect were reduced to smoking rubble in a matter of hours by wave after wave of bombers. The production of aviation fuel plummeted from nearly 180,000 tons in March 1944 to barely 10,000 tons just 3 months later. German attempts at rapid repair were almost always futile, as the Allies would simply return a few days later to bomb the newly fixed sections. The Allied forces systematically strangled the German supply of fuel, an essential element for all forms of mechanized warfare, not just the air force. This campaign was the true strategic counter to the technological threat posed by the Me-262 and other advanced German weapons. It did not require matching the jet's speed, it simply required denying it the energy to leave the ground. The scarcity of fuel became a paralyzing reality for German logistics, forcing commanders to ground training flights and restrict essential transport. Fuel became so precious that it was often only authorized for the final, most desperate operational missions. The destruction of the synthetic fuel industry meant that even perfect production of the Me-262 would have been meaningless. The Allied oil campaign was the ultimate war-winning strategy, proving that industrial warfare could be more lethal than direct combat. It was the strategic hammer that directly shattered the German commander's hopeful dream of jet-powered salvation. The success of the Allied oil campaign had a devastating and highly visible impact on the Me-262 squadrons. Even as the production lines for the jet fighters began to finally ramp up, the fuel to fly them simply ceased to exist. New jets were being manufactured and delivered to airfields, but they were immediately parked and covered, never to fly a combat mission. The lack of fuel created a cruel paradox. The best fighter aircraft in the world sat idly on the ground while Allied bombers flew overhead unimpeded. German airfields became storage depots for technological marvels that were effectively grounded ornaments, incapable of fulfilling their purpose. Pilots with hundreds of hours in conventional fighters could not accumulate the necessary training time in the challenging new jet. Every flight had to be justified as absolutely critical, and training sorties, essential for mastering the jet's nuances, were drastically curtailed. The inability to train new pilots meant that the small number of experienced jet aces could not be replaced or augmented. The entire operational tempo of the Me-262 force collapsed under the weight of this acute, debilitating fuel shortage. Commanders watched helplessly as the theoretical power of their advanced weapon evaporated into a logistical black hole. Fuel rationing became a matter of life and death for the remaining Luftwaffe units, further prioritizing piston engine interceptors over the thirsty jets. The lack of fuel also hindered the mobility of the ground crews, making it difficult to transport spare parts and perform essential maintenance. This forced immobility made the grounded jets vulnerable to strafing attacks by Allied fighters, who knew exactly where to find them. The Me-262's greatest enemy was not the P-51 Mustang or the B-17 bomber, but the emptiness of its own fuel tank. The technological dream of aerial dominance died not in the air, but on the tarmac, suffocated by the lack of a single, vital resource. Beyond the catastrophic fuel shortages, the Me-262 program was plagued by a host of compounding logistical and maintenance problems. The Jumo 00 for jet engine was a temperamental and relatively short-lived piece of machinery, requiring frequent and complex overhauls. Its limited operational life meant that engines had to be constantly swapped out and repaired, straining an already overstretched maintenance network. The production of replacement engines and critical spare parts could not keep pace with the high rate of engine failure and combat damage. The complex nature of the jet required highly specialized mechanics who were themselves becoming scarce as the war progressed. Even small maintenance issues could result in a jet being grounded for days or weeks, removing it from the critical air defense battle. The jet's vulnerability during takeoff and landing was exacerbated by the Allied focus on attacking German airfields. Runways were constantly bombed and cratered, forcing the jets to operate from makeshift, dispersed locations like stretches of highway. Operating from these primitive, unsecured sites further complicated the delicate process of refueling, rearming, and major maintenance. The simple act of taxiing the jet was difficult and dangerous due to the engine's sensitivity and the poor ground conditions. The Mi-262 consumed a colossal amount of fuel, making its operation uneconomical in an environment where every drop was rationed. For every hour of flight, many more hours of painstaking, specialized maintenance were required to ensure the jet's reliability. The logistical framework of the collapsing Third Reich was simply too brittle and too damaged to support such a demanding weapon system. The dream of a high-tech savior was choked not only by the absence of fuel but also by the 1,000 small failures of a crumbling industrial base. These accumulated logistical nightmares made it impossible to sustain the necessary concentration of jets required for a decisive impact. As the final months of the war descended, the German jet dream became a desperate, futile struggle against inevitable defeat. Commanders authorized final, mass sorties in a desperate attempt to show force and delay the relentless Allied advance. These late-war engagements, while occasionally successful, were often disorganized and quickly overwhelmed by the sheer number of enemy aircraft. The remaining pilots were exhausted, often malnourished, and operating on razor-thin margins of fuel and ammunition. Many missions were aborted due to engine failures, insufficient fuel, or the realization that the target area was too heavily defended. The jet pilots were acutely aware that they were flying the very last, most precious assets of the dying German war machine. The sight of Allied ground forces advancing on German airfields became a common, terrifying reality for the maintenance crews. The decision to abandon or destroy valuable Mi-262s to prevent them from falling into Allied hands became routine. There were last-gasp efforts to use the jets in a completely novel, desperate role, such as launching air-to-air rockets at bomber formations. Despite these flashes of technical brilliance, the overall strategic picture remained unchanged and continued to darken. The commander's earlier belief that the jets would save them had fully dissolved into the bleak knowledge of total failure. The failure was not in the machine itself, but in the political delays, the misplaced priorities, and the fatal vulnerability of the fuel supply. The jets were physically present, but the energy to unleash their potential had been bombed out of existence by the enemy. The final flights of the Mi-262 were acts of pure, doomed defiance, a brilliant technology making its final, futile gestures. The dream had not just been killed, it had been starved, grounded, and ultimately captured by the advancing Allied armies. The story of the Messerschmitt Mi-262 is a profound historical lesson in the intersection of technology and logistics in warfare. It stands as a stark reminder that even the most revolutionary weapon system is only as effective as the supply chain that supports it. German commanders were correct in their assessment of the jet's game-changing potential, they were wrong in their ability to sustain it. The fuel shortages proved to be the Achilles heel that negated the years of brilliant engineering and design work. Had the jet been prioritized and deployed purely as an interceptor in large numbers 1 or 2 years earlier, the air war might have been prolonged. However, the Allied focus on the synthetic oil industry demonstrated a superior strategic understanding of industrial warfare. The Mi-262's ultimate failure was a direct result of Germany's structural and industrial limitations under the strain of a global conflict. The jet fighter's design, despite its late-war defeat, immediately influenced post-war aviation development across the world. The United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union all studied the captured Mi-262s intensely, rapidly incorporating their features into their own jet programs. Elements like the swept-wing design became standard in the next generation of global jet fighters, establishing the blueprint for the Cold War era. The legacy of the jet is therefore twofold: a combat failure in World War II but a technological triumph for the modern age. It accelerated the transition from piston engine to jet-powered flight by at least 5 years, changing air power forever. The German dream of a war-winning superweapon was shattered, but the jet they created irrevocably shaped the future skies. The Me-262 remains a potent historical symbol of a technological leap that was tragically unfueled and ultimately too late. It serves as a constant, silent testament to the critical role that a secure and resilient logistical base plays in modern high-intensity conflict.